Joe Rogan, the comedian who doesn't get comedy. Joe Rogan is one of the most influential voices in media with a podcast empire and a massive following. However, when it comes to comedy, his instincts and execution often miss the mark. While Rogan's stand-up career spans decades, his humor has frequently been criticized for lacking depth, nuance, and originality. Whether he's failing to grasp jokes on his own podcast, relying on low-effort humor, or struggling to refine his comedic craft, Rogan has become a divisive figure in the world of comedy. Let's explore why Joe Rogan struggles to truly get comedy and how his approach fails to live up to the standards of the art form.
What is he doing? He's going to get that bird feeder?
He's going to unscrew the bird feeder.
He's doing whatever he wants, bro.
Oh my God, look how smart he is. Dude, this is insane. Look how smart this thing is. But also, look how confident it is in its strength.
And look at him looking over at the camera. He knows he's being filmed, dude.
Yeah, and look how he's... Yeah, I don't think he knows that. But look...
Missing the joke. One of the most glaring issues with Joe Rogan's comedic instincts is his repeated inability to recognize jokes, even when delivered by some of the sharpest comedians in the industry. As the host of the Joe Rogan Experience, Rogan often invites comedy heavyweights onto his show, providing a unique platform for banter and humor. However, his frequent missteps in identifying and engaging with humor create awkward moments for his guests and leave the audience cringing. A classic example of Rogan's comedic disconnect occurred when Shane Gillis joked about his firing from Saturday Night Live, saying it wasn't a big deal because he could just appear on Rogan's podcast. The comment was clearly meant to be a self-deprecating quip, poking fun at the absurdity of cancel culture and the podcasting world's embrace of controversy. Yet, instead of laughing or playing along, Rogan took the comment at face value, asking Gillis to elaborate. The joke, designed to be quick and punchy, lost all its momentum, creating an awkward lull that Gillis had to scramble to recover from. Another instance involves comedian Annie Letterman, who made a pun involving the Third Reich. The humor lay in the absurdity and wordplay, but Rogan completely missed the punchline, derailing the moment by asking what the term meant. His interruption forced Letterman to explain the joke, a death knell for any comedic moment, and turned what could have been a sharp, memorable exchange into an awkward and forgettable interaction. These examples highlight Rogan's inability to engage with humor that requires nuance or context. Many jokes, particularly those rooted in sarcasm, wordplay, or irony, depend on quick comprehension and a shared understanding between the comedian and the audience. Rogan's tendency to overanalyze or focus on the literal meaning of statements disrupts this dynamic, deflating the humor and shifting attention away from the punchline. Even more telling is how Rogan's responses often reveal a lack of trust in the joke itself. Great comedic hosts create an environment where jokes can thrive, adding their own humor to build on the moment. In contrast, Rogan frequently halts the momentum as if unsure whether the joke will land without his intervention. This tendency undermines his credibility as a comedic figure and casts doubt on his instincts. Comedians who have appeared on Rogan's podcast, such as Mark Normand and Theo Von, have subtly commented on these dynamics. Normand, known for his rapid-fire delivery, has joked about how difficult it can be to get a punchline across when Rogan is in literalist mode. Meanwhile, Theo Von has mastered the art of pivoting away from Rogan's interruptions, often turning Rogan's confusion into part of the bit. While these comedians adapt well, their ability to recover doesn't excuse Rogan's consistent mishandling of comedic opportunities. Rogan's struggle to recognize jokes isn't just about missing individual punchlines. It reflects a deeper gap in understanding what makes comedy work. A good comedian knows that timing and flow are critical. Interrupting or overanalyzing a joke kills its momentum and alienates the audience. In Rogan's case, these missteps are particularly glaring given his decades in the comedy world. They suggest that while he may have the platform of a comedy great, he lacks the instincts that make someone truly excel in the craft. Ultimately, Rogan's inability to recognize and engage with jokes reveals a fundamental flaw in his comedic approach. Instead of enhancing the humor, his literal responses and overanalysis often create awkward silences and missed opportunities. This disconnect not only frustrates his guests, but also diminishes the overall comedic energy of his interactions, highlighting a key reason why Rogan struggles to resonate as a comedic figure.
Look how good he is at climbing up. Dude, how many people, even if they could do that, if they had the kind of strength to do that, how many people would even figure out how to navigate that so easily?
Dude, Matt Eisman would host this. This is like American Ninja Warrior. Dude, you telling me that they don't steal some of these games from this?
Struggles with sarcasm and irony. Joe Rogan's difficulty with sarcasm and irony is one of the most telling indicators of his limitations as a comedian. These elements of humor require an understanding of subtlety, tone, and context, qualities that Rogan consistently struggles to grasp. While sarcasm and irony form the backbone of many great comedic exchanges, Rogan's overly literal interpretation of statements often derails the humor, leading to awkward and uncomfortable moments. A standout example occurred during an episode featuring Kevin Smith. Smith, known for his offbeat humor, jokingly credited his late dog with helping him write some of his best movies. The humor lay in the absurdity of the claim, but instead of laughing or playing along, Rogan earnestly asked, "How did your dog help you?" This misstep forced Smith to backtrack and clarify that it was a joke, robbing the moment of its comedic impact and creating an unnecessary pause in the flow of conversation. Similarly, Bill Burr, another comedian renowned for his quick wit, once made a lighthearted comment during an interview that Rogan completely misunderstood. Burr, frustrated by the lack of recognition for his sarcasm, had to explicitly say, "I'm joking, Joe," to make sure Rogan understood. The remark wasn't meant to be taken seriously. Burr's reaction highlights an issue many comedians face when interacting with Rogan: the need to over-explain their humor, which kills the timing and energy that are crucial to comedy. These interactions reveal a deeper problem. Rogan's literal-mindedness often places him at odds with the nuances of humor. Sarcasm and irony rely on a shared understanding between the comedian and the audience, a kind of unspoken agreement that allows the humor to land without needing overt explanation. Rogan's failure to pick up on these cues disrupts this dynamic, making him appear out of sync with the very craft he claims to champion. And part of this disconnect may stem from Rogan's analytical nature. As a podcaster, he's accustomed to dissecting ideas and engaging in detailed discussions, but this approach often clashes with the spontaneity and brevity required in comedy. Instead of embracing the playful ambiguity of sarcasm, Rogan tends to seek clarification, turning what could be funny into something laborious. Moreover, his missteps with irony aren't limited to one-on-one exchanges. In group settings, Rogan's failure to recognize ironic remarks has led to moments where his co-hosts and guests subtly poke fun at his lack of comedic awareness. For instance, comedians like Mark Norman and Theo Vaughn have joked about how difficult it is to land an ironic punchline around Rogan, often turning his confusion into part of the bit to salvage the moment. This struggle with sarcasm and irony also reflects poorly on Rogan's comedic instincts. Effective comedians are not only adept at delivering humor, but also at receiving it. They understand the importance of tone, timing, and context, and they know how to navigate humor that exists in the gray areas of conversation. Rogan's inability to do so leaves him lagging behind his peers, many of whom excel in these subtler forms of comedy. In the end, Rogan's struggles with sarcasm and irony go beyond individual moments of misunderstanding. They highlight a fundamental gap in his comedic abilities. While he thrives in environments that allow for extended discussions and literal exchanges, the quick wit and subtlety required for effective humor often elude him. This disconnect limits his ability to engage with humor in a meaningful way and further underscores the limitations of his comedic persona.
Parents were like real old when they had you, right? Or your dad was?
Yeah, my dad was. My dad was 70 when I was born.
Wow.
Yeah, he was born in 1910.
Holy shit, dude. You're from a different era. You got different genes.
Yeah, sometimes I do think I feel a little more tired. I feel a little bit...
No, that's not what I mean. Yeah. I mean, you got like early human genes.
Yeah.
You know, like you're a direct descendant from someone who was born in 1909.
Overuse of simple and crude humor. Joe Rogan's comedic style is defined by its heavy reliance on simple and crude humor, often prioritizing accessibility over depth or originality. While this approach has earned him a loyal audience, it has also drawn criticism for being repetitive and uninspired. Rogan's material frequently revolves around exaggerated stories about drugs, bodily functions, or his grievances with societal trends like cancel culture. These topics can provide fertile ground for comedy, but Rogan's execution rarely ventures beyond the surface, leaving his jokes feeling predictable and lacking the sharpness that defines great stand-up. One of Rogan's most common themes is his experience with DMT and other psychedelics. While his anecdotes about mind-bending trips and altered states of consciousness initially piqued interest, they have since become overplayed. Rogan often repeats the same jokes about hallucinating or encountering otherworldly beings, rarely adding new layers or perspectives. Instead of evolving his material to explore broader or more creative angles, he seems content to recycle the same drug-fueled punchlines, diminishing their impact over time. Another hallmark of Rogan's humor is his reliance on gross-out comedy. Jokes about bodily functions, bathroom habits, and other crude subjects dominate his routines, often eliciting cheap laughs, but failing to deliver the wit or complexity that resonate with broader audiences. While there's certainly a place for crude humor in stand-up, Rogan leans on it so heavily that it becomes a crutch, overshadowing any attempts at more sophisticated comedic commentary. And this reliance on low-effort humor extends to Rogan's rants about cancel culture and political correctness. Rather than offering fresh insights or exploring the complexities of these topics, he often falls back on exaggerated complaints that feel more like tired diatribes than comedic observations. His jokes about woke culture tend to repeat the same predictable beats, lampooning societal hypersensitivity without adding any nuance or originality to the conversation. What makes Rogan's overuse of simple humor particularly disappointing is the missed potential. Topics like drug use, societal norms, and political correctness are ripe for incisive, boundary-pushing comedy, but Rogan rarely takes the extra step to elevate his material. Comedians like George Carlin and Richard Pryor tackled similar themes with a level of depth and introspection that challenged audiences to think critically while laughing. In contrast, Rogan's jokes often feel like the comedic equivalent of fast food, easy to consume, but ultimately forgettable. Part of the issue lies in Rogan's focus on catering to a specific demographic. His comedy appeals primarily to a base of fans who value relatability and simplicity over sophistication. This approach has undoubtedly contributed to his popularity, but it has also pigeonholed him as a comedian who prioritizes easy laughs over pushing comedic boundaries. While this strategy may work in the short term, it limits his ability to grow as a performer and reach broader audiences, and moreover, Rogan's reliance on simple humor has drawn criticism from his peers. Comedians who share the stage or appear on his podcast often highlight the contrast between Rogan's straightforward style and their own more layered approaches. For instance, when engaging with sharp-witted comedians like Mark Normand or Bill Burr, Rogan's humor often pales in comparison, exposing the limitations of his comedic repertoire. Ultimately, Rogan's overuse of simple and crude humor reflects a reluctance to evolve or take risks as a comedian. By sticking to predictable topics and easy punchlines, he undercuts his potential to create comedy that challenges and engages his audience on a deeper level. While his approach may resonate with fans who appreciate his unfiltered style, it leaves much to be desired for those seeking humor with more creativity and substance.
Older was so smart and thoughtful. He wrote my 4 best movies. That's why he died. I made Tusk and Yoga Hosers. Like, without that dog writing for me.
How'd he write for you?
It's a joke, Joe. He was feral. he was just saying he was so smart.
Bro.
He was so smart. How smart was he? He's so smart he wrote my last few scripts. Joke didn't quite land.
Overanalyzing jokes. Joe Rogan's habit of overanalyzing jokes is one of the most consistent criticisms of his comedic instincts. Rather than letting humor flow naturally, Rogan often interrupts or derails punchlines by dissecting their meaning or offering unnecessary context. This analytical approach clashes with the spontaneity and rhythm that make comedy effective, creating moments that are awkward for both his guests and the audience. A prime example of this occurred when Theo Von made a quick, lighthearted joke about powdered wigs. Instead of laughing or adding to the humor, Rogan launched into a detailed explanation about the historical origins of powdered wigs, turning what should have been a playful moment into a mini history lesson. While Vaughn is skilled at pivoting and often uses Rogan's derailments as material for more jokes, the interruption killed the momentum, forcing the conversation to recover from Rogan's overcomplication. Rogan's tendency to dissect humor stems from his role as a podcast host, where he often delves into complex topics and engages in lengthy discussions. While this approach works for serious conversations, it becomes a liability when applied to comedy. Instead of engaging with a joke in the moment, Rogan's instinct is to pick it apart, as if trying to uncover some deeper meaning that was never intended. This habit frustrates his guests, particularly comedians who rely on timing and rhythm to deliver effective punchlines. Another instance of Rogan's overanalyzing occurred during a conversation with Bill Burr. Burr, known for his sharp wit and ability to keep exchanges dynamic, made a sarcastic remark that Rogan completely missed. Instead of recognizing the humor, Rogan responded seriously, prompting Burr to explicitly say, "I'm joking, Joe." Moments like these reveal a gap in Rogan's comedic instincts, as he often fails to recognize when a joke is meant to land without further explanation. And this behavior not only disrupts individual exchanges, but also diminishes the overall energy of Rogan's podcast. Great comedians understand that humor often lies in brevity and subtlety. A well-timed laugh or a quick follow-up can amplify a joke, while over-explaining or over-analyzing smothers it. Rogan's inability to let jokes breathe creates a stilted dynamic where guests must constantly recalibrate to maintain the comedic flow. What's particularly ironic is that Rogan's overanalysis often turns funny moments into unintentional comedy. His serious tone and earnest attempts to explain jokes can be amusing in their own right, but this amusement comes at the cost of the original humor. Instead of enhancing the comedic experience, Rogan's behavior shifts the focus away from the joke itself and onto his reaction, making the interaction less about the humor and more about his misunderstanding. And this tendency also reflects a broader issue in Rogan's comedic persona, his struggle to balance his roles as a conversationalist and a comedian. While his podcast thrives on deep dives and intellectual discussions, comedy relies on quick wit and the ability to adapt in the moment. Rogan's overanalyzing habit highlights the tension between these two approaches, exposing a weakness in his ability to shift seamlessly between serious and comedic tones. Ultimately, Rogan's tendency to overanalyze jokes points to a fundamental misunderstanding of comedic timing and flow. By focusing on explanation rather than engagement, he often stifles the natural rhythm of conversations, leaving his guests and the humor struggling to recover. This habit not only frustrates seasoned comedians, but also underscores why Rogan's comedic instincts fall short of his peers in the comedy world.
He's like, if we just get you to the first episode, like, people will see you're not a piece of person.
Right.
Like, just talk. And I was like, whatever, I'll do. If I get fired here, whatever, I'll just go do Joe Rogan next week and I'll be fine. Anyway, I thought that was funny. No?
What?
I was like, I literally.
Is that what you thought?
I literally thought that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I thought it would be funny.
Well, it could have been funny.
Yeah.
I was booked up, though.
No, it's fine. It was just funny to truly. That was a conversation I actually had.
Really?
In Lorne Michaels' office in the middle of that.
Stagnant material in stand-up. Joe Rogan's stand-up career has been marked by repeated criticism for its lack of evolution and originality. Despite decades in comedy, Rogan's material often feels stagnant, leaning on predictable topics and shallow observations, rather than the fresh insights or clever reinvention that define great stand-up. This inability to adapt and grow as a performer has left his routines feeling more like extensions of his podcast than thoughtfully crafted comedic performances. One of the clearest examples of this issue is Rogan's Netflix special, Triggered. Released at the height of debates around cancel culture and political correctness, the special relied heavily on these themes, offering little more than broad complaints about societal hypersensitivity. While these topics are ripe for exploration, Rogan's approach often lacked depth or creativity, reducing complex cultural issues to repetitive gripes and surface-level commentary. Audiences expecting nuanced humor or unique perspectives were instead met with tired takes that felt like rehashed podcast material, rather than an evolution of his comedic voice. Another hallmark of Rogan's stand-up is its heavy reliance on his familiar tropes, drug anecdotes, exaggerated masculinity, and rants about societal norms. While these themes have long been staples of his act, they rarely develop or shift, leaving his routines feeling repetitive and predictable. For instance, his jokes about DMT and psychedelic experiences, once novel, now feel like a go-to crutch, recycled across multiple specials with little variation or added insight. Instead of expanding these ideas into new territory, Rogan seems content to revisit the same ground, delivering material that feels stuck in time. This stagnation is particularly glaring when compared to comedians who continually refine their craft. Figures like Dave Chappelle and Louis C.K., despite their own controversies, have been lauded for their ability to reinvent themselves, tackling evolving cultural landscapes with fresh perspectives and boundary-pushing humor. Rogan, by contrast, seems unwilling, or unable, to take similar risks, relying instead on a formula that prioritizes accessibility over innovation. Part of the issue lies in Rogan's reluctance to challenge his own comedic instincts. As one of the most influential figures in media with a massive podcasting platform and a loyal fan base, Rogan faces little incentive to evolve. His audience has come to expect a specific brand of humor, and he appears content to deliver it without pushing the boundaries of his material. This creates a feedback loop where Rogan's routines cater to his existing fans but fail to attract or resonate with a broader audience seeking more sophisticated or dynamic comedy. Critics have also noted that Rogan's stand-up often lacks the structure and precision expected from a seasoned comedian. His routines frequently resemble extended rants, where punchlines take a backseat to long-winded storytelling or opinionated monologues. While this style works in the context of his podcast, where audiences tune in for his unfiltered thoughts, it falls short in a stand-up setting where tight pacing and carefully crafted jokes are essential. This lack of progression has been a recurring theme in reviews of Rogan's stand-up specials. Audiences and critics alike have pointed out that his material often feels dated, failing to keep pace with changing cultural dynamics or his own personal growth. Instead of using his platform to explore new ideas or experiment with different comedic approaches, Rogan seems stuck in a comfort zone that prioritizes familiarity over creativity. Ultimately, Rogan's stagnant material reflects a missed opportunity. With his platform and influence, he has the potential to craft comedy that challenges, inspires, and entertains on a deeper level. Instead, his routines often feel like a rehashing of old ideas, leaving many to question whether Rogan truly prioritizes stand-up as an art form or simply uses it as another outlet for his existing persona. While his loyal fans may continue to enjoy his performances, his inability to evolve has left his work falling short of the high expectations set by his prominence in the comedy world.
You know that that's where those powdered wigs came from? You know those powdered wigs that old dudes used to wear and the people in court used to wear? And
Oh, yeah.
that all came from a pair of rich, noble... Where were they again? In France?
Wiggers, I think they
France.
called them.
No, wiggers are white people that wish they were black. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
I saw coyotes. I was like, whoa.
Somebody reported a coyote fight in my neighborhood when I was growing up, and it was somebody made that up, but the cops still showed up. And I remember they interviewed everybody like, we know anything about it, dude.
Do you think coyotes fight? I wonder if they do fight with each other.
I don't think
I've never heard of them fighting.
At this
But it
point,
must make sense. Someone has to be the boss.
Echo chamber of validation. Joe Rogan's massive platform has cultivated an echo chamber that shields him from meaningful criticism, both as a comedian and a media personality. With millions of loyal fans and peers who often tread carefully around him, Rogan rarely receives the constructive feedback necessary for artistic growth. This environment of constant agreement and validation has contributed to the stagnation of his comedic craft, as Rogan remains insulated from the accountability that drives improvement. One of the key factors behind this echo chamber is Rogan's dominant presence in the comedy and podcasting worlds. As the host of the Joe Rogan Experience, one of the most popular podcasts globally, Rogan wields significant influence over his guests, many of whom rely on his platform to boost their visibility. This power dynamic creates a culture where challenging Rogan's ideas or comedic instincts can feel risky. Guests often choose to agree with him or deflect rather than offer genuine critique, leaving Rogan in an environment that constantly reinforces his approach. Even when comedians like Shane Gillis or Mark Norman subtly highlight Rogan's comedic shortcomings, their remarks are often framed as lighthearted jabs rather than serious critiques. For instance, Norman has joked about how difficult it can be to land a punchline with Rogan, while Gillis has poked fun at Rogan's tendency to miss jokes or overanalyze humor. However, these comments are rarely followed by deeper conversations about Rogan's comedic style, allowing the broader issue to go unaddressed. This lack of accountability extends to Rogan's fan base, which plays a significant role in perpetuating the echo chamber. Rogan's followers often praise his humor uncritically, celebrating his straightforward and unfiltered approach, while dismissing more nuanced criticism as jealousy or bias. This unwavering support creates a feedback loop where Rogan's comedic missteps are either ignored or reframed as intentional choices, further insulating him from constructive feedback. The effects of this echo chamber are evident in Rogan's stagnant material. Without external pressure to evolve or refine his craft, he continues to rely on the same tropes and comedic strategies that defined his early career. This complacency is particularly glaring when compared to comedians who actively seek out criticism and use it to push their boundaries. Figures like Dave Chappelle and Ali Wong, for example, have embraced the challenge of addressing controversial topics with depth and innovation, constantly refining their material to reflect changing cultural dynamics. Rogan, by contrast, seems content to repeat familiar patterns, confident in the validation provided by his fanbase and peers. Moreover, the echo chamber has led to a conflation of Rogan's podcasting success with his comedic abilities. Many of Rogan's fans view him as a comedic authority simply because of his prominence in media rather than evaluating his stand-up on its own merits. This perception reinforces the idea that Rogan's comedic approach doesn't need improvement, further discouraging self-reflection or growth. Ultimately, Rogan's echo chamber of validation represents a missed opportunity for a comedian with his level of influence. While his platform has given him unparalleled reach, it has also shielded him from the challenges and critiques that drive artistic development. By surrounding himself with agreement rather than accountability, Rogan has limited his potential to evolve as a comedian, leaving his material feeling increasingly dated and uninspired. Without a willingness to step outside this echo chamber, Rogan risks cementing his place as a stagnant performer rather than a dynamic and innovative comedic voice. Podcast success overshadowing comedy. Joe Rogan's meteoric rise as a podcaster has fundamentally reshaped his public persona, but it has also overshadowed his identity as a comedian. The success of the Joe Rogan Experience has turned Rogan into one of the most influential voices in media, but this dominance in podcasting has come at a cost to his stand-up career. The qualities that make Rogan an effective podcaster, long-form conversations, deep dives into complex topics, and a casual, unfiltered tone, don't translate well to the world of stand-up, where precision, brevity, and crafted punchlines are essential. Audiences who are drawn to Rogan's podcast often approach his stand-up expecting a similar level of depth and variety. On his show, Rogan tackles everything from politics and science to fitness and conspiracy theories, engaging in hours-long discussions with an array of fascinating guests. This breadth of content has built an audience that views Rogan as a thought leader and cultural commentator. However, when those same fans watch his stand-up, they're frequently met with surface-level jokes and predictable routines that fail to deliver the complexity they associate with his podcast. This disconnect highlights a significant identity crisis for Rogan. While his podcast thrives on open-ended discussions and improvisation, stand-up comedy demands a sharper, more deliberate approach. Rogan's reliance on the loose conversational style he employs on his podcast often leaves his stand-up feeling unpolished and underdeveloped. Instead of presenting carefully constructed sets with layered punchlines and innovative perspectives, his performances frequently resemble extended podcast rants, lacking the refinement that defines great comedy. This identity crisis is further compounded by Rogan's immense success as a podcaster, which has overshadowed his role as a comedian in the eyes of many fans. For audiences who primarily know Rogan as a podcast host, his stand-up feels secondary, almost like a hobby rather than a serious pursuit. This perception isn't helped by the fact that Rogan's stand-up specials often recycle themes and ideas from his podcast, reinforcing the notion that his comedy is an extension of his podcast persona rather than a distinct art form. Critics have noted that Rogan's comedic material often mirrors the conversational tone of his podcast, with long-winded storytelling and loosely connected observations. While this style can work in a podcast setting where the audience expects extended discussions, it falls flat in stand-up where timing, structure, and economy of language are critical. Rogan's inability to adapt his podcasting strengths to the demands of comedy underscores the challenges of balancing two vastly different mediums. Additionally, Rogan's success in podcasting has created an environment where his comedic shortcomings go largely unchallenged. With millions of loyal fans who celebrate his every move, Rogan faces little pressure to refine his stand-up material or experiment with new comedic approaches. This lack of accountability has contributed to the stagnation of his comedy as he continues to rely on familiar tropes and repetitive themes without exploring the deeper potential of his craft. Ultimately, Rogan's podcast success has overshadowed his comedy career, creating a disconnect between the expectations of his audience and the reality of his stand-up. While his podcast allows him to explore a wide range of topics with depth and nuance, his comedy often lacks the precision and innovation needed to stand out in a competitive field. This imbalance has left Rogan in a unique position, a podcasting giant whose comedic identity feels increasingly peripheral, raising questions about whether his stand-up can ever regain its relevance in the shadow of his media empire. Conclusion. Joe Rogan's struggles with comedy stem from a combination of literal-mindedness, reliance on simplistic humor, and a lack of growth in his craft. While his podcasting success is undeniable, his comedic shortcomings reveal a performer who hasn't fully embraced the complexities of the art form. Effective comedy requires nuance, timing, and a willingness to evolve, qualities that Rogan's work often lacks. By failing to adapt and refine his approach, Rogan has solidified his place as a polarizing figure in the comedy world, raising questions about whether his comedic career can ever live up to his larger-than-life persona.